Welcome to the Lead Pursuit Podcast, a podcast covering Blood Red Skies, a game of World War II aerial combat. Welcome to episode 13 of the Lead Pursuit Podcast. Tonight we're changing things up a little bit and we're moving away from the hardcore dynamic of the basic game, the expansions to the game, aircraft cards, and we're going a little bit off the reservation. Tonight I'm joined by Rosalind, the creator of an expansion titled Jet Age Edition. And it's a created expansion. It's taking the game a direction that probably nobody would have initially thought, all the way up into the modern jet era, and having to make some of the compromises and game designer decisions that really come into creating something that is vastly different from where we started. So Rosalind, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. We've got Brett and Chris both on, so thanks for joining us tonight.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
Well, good. So how did you end up going from a World War II dogfighting game that probably is the most basic, the most straightforward set of one pamphlet rules to saying, I want to take it to the exact opposite end of history and physics and everything else that goes into building a game, and I want to create an expansion to draw it that way?
Well, that's it's an interesting story. It's a long story.
We have all night. It's a podcast. It doesn't cost extra.
All right. Well, so basically, I picked up Blood Red Skies. One of my friends bought the box set, and I tried a game of it, and of course, I loved it. I'd never really been as much into the World War II fighters as much as I had been into jet fighters. So, of course, Blood Red Skies was great. Loved it. Probably one of my favorite games, period. Aside from maybe Battletech or something along those lines. And then from there, it's like, yeah, this is great, but, my fighter jets, I kind of need them. Same friend sourced really cheap Trumpeter 1x350 fighters. So I'm just like, you know what? If we're going to do this, we're going to do it. And I have a bit of a history of making mods for games just about in every game I've played.
Oh, so you're one of those who can't just sit back and take all the hard work of the designer and play the rules as...
I'm a bit stubborn, and I'm a bit... I don't know if there's a word for it, but we'll go with stubborn. I want what I want, and if it doesn't exist, then I will make it. So when I played X-Wing way back in the day, like 2014 to 2016, I had a habit of making custom cards for it, and then when X-Wing wasn't really enough for me, I started a modification that turned into more of a complete overhaul that I called X-Wing Tactical Combat System, or TCS. And that basically revamped the entire game. It changed the fundamental way that the game plays. It introduced ground combat, more granular damage systems, like you name it. I changed it in TCS. Ultimately, that didn't really go anywhere. As with most mods that kind of completely change up the way the game plays, it turns out, and I didn't know this at the time, it turns out that if people play a game, it probably means they like the game as it is.
Strange. It's weird that way.
Yeah, exactly. So TCS didn't really go anywhere, but I loved the rules. So what I ended up doing with that is, take Star Wars completely out of it. Made up my own sci-fi IP, and that's a game that I've been working on for like the last 2 years.
Nice. Okay, cool.
That's really been my main project, but Jet Age Edition was something special, actually, because funnily enough, I'm here on the podcast for it, so I imagine it has some merit.
Yes, or else would be roasting you instead of inviting you to the podcast, so...
Hey, a good roast is fun, too.
Look at this creation she's thrown our way. No.
Yeah, it's a little rough around the edges. mostly, in my opinion, mostly because this is one of my, I guess, side projects. But I do love deeply and care for the work that I have done. But ultimately, yeah, modding and tabletop game design, I don't know why, but it's in my blood. I feel like I am compelled to do it whenever I can.
Well, Rosalind, you started out and you said you were a BattleTech background, and as soon as you said that, and then you said, I didn't care for the granularity in the Star Wars games, and I'm like, oh, gee, yeah, I understand that completely. Knowing your BattleTech background, because I've got some hardcore BattleTech buddies up here, and I can tell you that's a whole nother level.
That's why Chris plays Magic the Gathering all the time.
Dude, no matter how many times you pound that one, it's just not going to be true. Nobody even believes it. They've seen pictures of me. They know I don't weigh 500 pounds. People know I shower. They know I'm married. Yes, I'm in a basement, but it's by choice.
The story is already all over Malaysia. I have Chris, the world champion Magic player, on the podcast. So, sorry.
Hey, that guy's worth a lot of money. So if you give me some of that Magic money, I may even consider it.
All right. Well, back to where we were talking about Jet Age Edition. So it's kind of funny you said it very well. People play a game because they're satisfied with the way it plays. But the problem is, if you're a game tinkerer, and I'm sure Brett and Chris will now confess that I'm a little bit that way with creating cards and scenarios, you're already not satisfied with the rules. You may enjoy them, but you go, well, what if I did X, or what if I changed this mechanic? Yeah. How did that play into Jet Age Edition? Because all of a sudden, with Jet Age version 1.3 now, you've had to go back and change some of your compromises because, well, Andy came out with the Jet card, and so all of a sudden we had some baseline rules for how Jets were expected to behave. How much did that kind of upset the apple cart and make you start over?
Not as much as you might think. So I must admit right now, we've already covered this. Yes, I'm a BattleTech player. And that's
why I like Rosalind. Being a former BattleTech player who gave up the addiction.
I don't think I will ever give that up. But that plays into this because that I have a bias, and I have a pretty strong bias towards granularity. And that's from a game design perspective, that can be a problem. Because Blood Red Skies is fantastic because it's not really granular, but it so flawlessly encapsulates what dogfighting is, especially for the era. It's just fantastic.
Right.
The problem with Jets is that, well, World War II planes were harder, and this is just my opinion, my understanding. World War II planes were harder to fly than they were to fight, I guess, because you had the one direction of guns. That was really the only way to shoot somebody down. And with just flying the plane, you had like your throttle, you had your boost, you had your water injection if your plane had it, you had your propeller pitch, you had your supercharger stages. Like, you have all of this stuff, and if you can simplify it to just moving 6 inches or 7 inches, then you pretty much have simplified most everything about flying a World War II fighter. With jets, it's kind of arguably the other way around. It's a lot easier to fly the plane. You have autopilot. You just have the one throttle. It's just a matter of, the flight stick and the throttle. That's kind of it when it comes to just keeping the plane in the air. But the combat is way harder.
See, I told you, Doug, a monkey can do it.
You can say what you want. I flew, you stacked boxes. Questions? Okay, thank you very much.
I really like Rosalind. Rosalind, they wouldn't even let him fly. They made him sit in the back.
I'm sorry, Rosalind. I forgot this is not a logistics. We invited the box stacker, but apparently he thinks he has a voice here.
I wanna clear my name a little bit. I don't think that it's easy, and I do a lot of combat flight sims. I know that's hard. It's just not as hard.
Well, I think you hit on a point a lot of people forget about, is that, and it's tough in the crossover years like Korea, Vietnam. But if you go from one end of the spectrum to the other, if I say I want to start in 1939 and go to 2019, the airplane management is what you did in 1939. In 2019, you do the systems management, and you manage the radar, your sensors, individual weapon systems. So it's two very different tactical problems, which will lead into something we'll talk about later about scale and tactical decision making. But like you said, you've already set yourself up for a difficulty because now I'm trying to simulate something that, in a sense, kind of is granular. Does my radar detect the target? Does my missile get to the target? Things that, and I don't know if you've ever played Air War. I think you've played probably Check Your Six and some of the other ones that try to thread the needle of granularity. Because unless you go to the Air War level, sometimes you feel like there's a detail I'm forgetting. I'm forgetting some counter to this system.
Yeah, I am aware of Air War, and hopefully that's all.
Yes, never play it. I think I logged 6 games in my entire life.
Yeah, while I appreciate granularity, I also have to acknowledge there is a point at which you can have so much granularity that the game isn't even fun anymore, or arguably even a game.
Right. Right.
One of those examples is Air War. Another is, I think it's Squadron Strike.
Okay.
The sci-fi, like, full Newtonian physics game.
Yeah, that doesn't sound fun.
Exactly. And, maybe that's a conversation to have later, because that relates to a few things here. But for now, I'll leave that be. The point is that I play DCS World. I play IL-2. Like, I'm big into these games. So, of course, this is important to me, but also I understand that if I can't relate these concepts of modern tactical jet fighting to the simplistic system of Blood Red Skies, then I don't think that Jet Age Edition will be a success, even on my own terms of, do I think the game design is good? And that's been a challenge, because there's so many variables in jet combat with missiles and radar cross-section. God, just thinking about it is like overwhelming me with the amount of variables at play. So as a result, it is absolutely a challenge to adapt it to Blood Red Skies. Part of what I have tried to do is basically kind of do the same thing that Blood Red Skies did with movement, which is assume that the pilot has a basic understanding of how to maximize the performance of their plane in a particular scenario, and then basically consolidate all of that into a single statistic if I can.
Right.
And I've tried to do that with missiles, basically, which is kind of the cornerstone of how modern jet fighting works. If you can simplify that down to basically a range band and a firepower value, just like the base game does, you can kind of get there. And I'm still tweaking this. Like right now, 1.31 is in the works with a lot of changes.
Uh-oh. Guess I better start getting ready to read up. Yeah, I understand that there's always what I'll call kind of the tyranny of scale, that as you start trying to compress some of these things down to make it playing on the living room floor, which we've all seen some miniatures games be that big. Oh, Chambers. I think I played Epic on the living room floor all the time. But when you'd say, okay, I want this to scale down, now all of a sudden you say, well, how do I make it so that the Sidewinder doesn't have a 1-inch range in comparison to the Phoenix? Because now I have missiles on the exact opposite end of the scale.
Exactly.
Of Cape. There's some. I don't want to say it's suspension of disbelief, but I mean, once again, we are playing a miniatures game. We are playing it on a table, but there has to be a point where, as a game designer, you go, there needs to be range bands, but I can't make it as a 1-to-1 representation. So I thought that was interesting to it, and thank you for the notes you've put, at least in previous editions and this edition, talking about some of the design compromises for speed and for afterburner and things like that, because it helps me look at it not in analyzing a rule to be perfectly scaled, but a rule to be able to represent an action. And that's that's the tough part. Is you start adding the higher speeds in there. You go, well, I would go across the entire living room floor in one move for some of these aircraft.
Exactly. And I'm big on that. I have a programming background. I am going to school for computer science, and one of the things that they drill in your head from day one when you're coding is comment your code, why you did this, why you did it the way you did it. And I take that back into game design where, okay, I did this, but why?
Well, and that was always one of my favorite things. I grew up in the era of Dragon magazine when the latest D&D expansion came out or a new game from TSR. You'd open up Dragon and you'd read the designer's notes. When something new from Games Workshop came out, you'd open White Dwarf and you'd commentary about here's what we did to change the rules a little bit. And I think a lot of games have gone away from that in recent years, that it's kind of all behind the curtain and they don't want you to look behind the curtain. But I think as players, a lot of times we want to know, why does something work the way it does? I know for me, with Blood Red Skies, there were a lot of things I wanted to ask Andy and go, why'd you choose that? Because it doesn't make sense to me, but once he explains it, you go, oh, okay, got it. It's a compromise. There's things you couldn't do.
Exactly. I'm very much the same way. I consider myself a transparent person with the way that I think, the way that I design things, the way that I write. I want people to understand where I'm coming from, especially in Jet Age Edition, because much like Blood Red Skies had to compromise on a lot of things to get to where they are now, I have to compromise on a lot of things as well with regards to missiles, radar, just so much. And
right.
I don't, especially because I'm writing a mod that I can't sell, I can't push marketing, I can't make pretty things for it. I'm a writer, not a graphic designer. So I can't make a lot of things that would polish this up and make it to the quality level that Warlord could do. It's especially important for people to understand why things are the way they are and why I wrote them that way. Because if I don't, then why would you play the mod?
Right. Absolutely. Well, Chris, you have kind of a different perspective on this, because I know we haven't had a chance for you and I to sit down and play Jets, so at least you don't have the baggage of playing a lot of the Mig Alley stuff. What were your thoughts just taking a look at the mod as a build out to Blood Red Skies?
Well, I was just looking at it from, truly base mechanics. I read through the Afterburner rules. They made sense. I mean, when you compare them to the way Blood Red Skies works. And Rosalind already touched on it with the range bands. And that was the one thing that I was looking for when I looked at it, was like, okay, how do we stack a Sidewinder against an AMRAAM or a Phoenix? And just me with just knowing what I do about those systems, never having flown a jet, but knowing that there's a monumental leap between those systems and what their capabilities are. How do you compress those down on the table? And I thought the bands, when I initially looked at it, I went, well, if you're going to play Blood Red Skies as a jet game, those are pretty close to about the area where I think I would have gone with it. So all of that made sense. And I don't have the baggage. I still haven't done the everybody drops in and everybody flies around the table and half the table's gone in the first turn. So that's going to be a big jump for me. But I'm still, I guess I'm kind of like, wait and see with Jets. I mean, I'm still not 100% even in with the Mig Alley. So I'm interested in this because this helps me understand Mig Alley a little bit more too.
Okay. Well,
so
Rosalind, have you had a chance to play Mig Alley with the new rules for Jet and the rest of it?
Well, I have played base Mig Alley. I have not played it in the Jet Age Edition rules because you can do that. But I have played the base Mig Alley, and that's where the 1.3 update came from, and I'll touch on that later.
Okay.
And what went into that for me. But all I have to say is maybe some of the people listening have seen my post that I made on the Ready Room page about playing Mig Alley. I fell in love immediately. It is now by far my favorite way to play Blood Red Skies. It's fantastic. The Jet card is probably the smartest game design instance of anything I've ever seen to how monumentally it changes the game. Yeah, I love it.
I think there's a lot of people that don't appreciate that, and it's kind of funny. I don't know the comfort level of gamers that they don't like one simple thing like a card upending their entire understanding of how the game is supposed to work, or if it's because they just had a different vision of what 1950s aerial dogfighting is. But I've been surprised at I don't want to use the term backlash. I don't know what the term is, but the grumbling about the introduction of the jet card and what that meant and how that fundamentally changed a jet v jet battle. I think, like I told people, is you really have to play it. You play it a couple times, you go, oh, I get why it's done this way. It may not be the way I would have modeled jets, or it may not be the way that I think jets should be modeled, but in at least Doug's opinion, it's a good way to simulate a lot of the capabilities of jets without making overly complex ways of tracking energy, throttle position, all those kind of things,
Exactly.
You think that backlash comes from maybe people's perspective being they want to, or they're thinking maybe Jet 2 is going to show up on their, Battle of Britain table and they're going to be playing those kind of games? I mean, because that would be completely out of scale.
I don't know if it's the competitive side where they say I need to be able to walk to any table and play any force that gets thrown down against me. I would hope not. Now we've talked about a few times on the podcast the American competitive gaming gene, that aberrant gene. There may be people who don't like it because they now feel the game is broken. Yes, competitive players. I hates them. I hates them all.
I don't. I understand that competitive players are kind of the cornerstone of what keeps a game alive.
Oh, they really are. Especially it's fascinating to look, especially in the 40K community, 30K and 40K community, that narrative, while it may sell a few models, doesn't sell all the codexes and doesn't sell all the box sets and as much as competitive play does.
Yeah. And it was the same thing in X-Wing, honestly. Like, without the competitive community, X-Wing would have died a miserable death a long time ago. But granted, I think I'm really not sure why people are grumbling about it. I feel like, Warlord's still rolling out World War II releases on a consistent basis, so I don't think that can be it. I think that the jet card itself is a really accurate representation of what it's like to go from flying a World War II plane to flying a jet in the Korean War. It completely upends the perspective of a dogfight, which it did. That's what happened. I honestly don't know. I suspect that this kind of thing will, if for wherever the competitive play is, because there isn't any near me, I'm sure that this will not be allowed at the same time.
Right. Yeah. It to me, it only makes sense that you say, well, tables for jet armies and we will have tables for prop armies and never the twain shall meet. Because I've played a few scenarios with jets and props and they're cool to do. There's cool things to do historically with those scenarios. But I think if you want a truly balanced and fair chance to meet your opponent across the table, it's not going to be that way.
Exactly. It's not just a novelty, right?
What's that?
Those other kind of missions you're talking about are really more or less a novelty. It's the jet on jet thing is really the mainstay of that system.
So I'm gonna throw a spear at you on that one, and I'm gonna say this is part of our problem with where miniature gaming has gone in the US. So remember, I'm an old guy. I used to play Squad Leader and Panzer Leader and all those games around a table, and we used to not have this thought that everything had to be perfectly balanced, that there was you wanted some ability of the general himself and some ability of the army, and there was a feel that you could be evaluated on your skill by not having to have your armies in perfect parity. And I think there's a lot of things to be said in the prop scenarios if the scenario is scripted right, that it's not so much a novelty, but you can't just walk up to a table, throw 4 jets down and throw 8 props down and go, we have a balanced game. But if you walk in and you say, okay, it's a jet v prop scenario, so here's kind of our baseline rules. We're always going to use low altitude haze so that we simulate the props being able to get down in the weeds and make it difficult to be shot. We know we're going to go in there and simulate high altitude advantage for anything that's like a twin Mustang or something. So you give it a chance to actually have a fighting chance against a jet. If you script some of those things well, then the scenario makes sense, and it's not so much kind of a one-off. Let's just see how the game goes. Because I think we showed it with the P-38 scenario that just because the first time out the gate, the dice go against you and you seriously lose that battle in the first turn and a half. I mean, in Blood Red Skies, that takes 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Put them all back on the table and try it again. And we tried the exact physical same setup, and it was a totally different game the second time through on our P-38. And so I think I think that's kind of the beauty of the Blood Red Skies system is, as we talked about last episode, the board edge means a lot. And if you script that and you script the theater cards and doctrine cards, man, you can really take some asymmetric forces and make it so it's fun to play them. Does it mean that even number of times the prop guys are going to table the jet guys? Probably not. But they're not going to feel dissatisfied playing the game at that.
I'll be honest. I don't think I've ever truly been dissatisfied playing Blood Red Skies, period.
Oh, yeah. I get beat in 10 minutes and I'm still happy.
Exactly. That
certainly didn't work. Let's try that again.
That's the cool thing about the game is that losing doesn't feel bad. Or at least it doesn't for me.
I think a lot of it's time. And Chris and I have talked about this. We sit down to a 30K or 40K game, and we invest 3 hours just to get 4 turns. And you find yourself tabled by some game mechanic you didn't understand about the enemies. And you go, that just kind of took all the fun out of the last 4 hours that I've played.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that's important to note.
I mean, yes. I don't mind playing something that's asymmetric when I go in knowing it's asymmetric. If I'm playing an asymmetric scenario for the reason of feeling something that really occurred in history, I mean, there's nothing more asymmetric than some of these small, mid-sized bombers going up against fighters in World War II. But it happened a lot. And, that there were times when that was just the ugly reality of war. And in those situations, winning was just getting away. And when you make just getting away a victory mechanic for those little guys, I mean, it brings that tension that we're all looking for in gaming. You want that build up, and you want that tension, and then you want that narrow victory, or that thing that occurs within the rules that is thematic of history. And in this case, it's history. And in sci-fi games, it's something else, but it's like history. You're playing a system that's based on an IP that has a history of what went on. And I think that's what Blood Red Skies does really well.
Well, I mean, I still love Scenario Zero. I mean, that's nothing more than a run down the recce platform scenario, but it's fun, and trying it with different aircraft, different configuration. There's nothing more asymmetric than that one where you can't shoot back.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree.
Hey, Ross, I'm the least familiar with Jet Age Edition, and there may be listeners that aren't familiar with it either. Could you maybe give me a rundown on what a typical game, or how you want the game experience to be? What can I do when I'm playing Jet Age Edition?
Okay. So essentially, the goal is to provide as much as I can of the basic Blood Red Skies experience. It's not supposed to be a complicated game. You're not supposed to have to really stress out over, bookkeeping or any of that as nearly as much. What Jet Age Edition is supposed to bring to the table is essentially just, I want to seamlessly add in the ability to play modern jets into the system. Now that can be difficult. I can't use the same speed values, like it's not a 1x50 system. But what you can do in Jet Age Edition is essentially, I want to add in the ability for you to fight with missiles, which adds in a whole lot of different things. In missile combat, there's a lot more, I guess, defensive play than there is against guns. So if in Jet Age Edition, if you get a missile fired at you and it's a head-on attack, you have the opportunity to spend advantage, drop down to a lower advantage level, and then turn 90 degrees to the side so that you're going defensive, where in the same way where you get a ping in your aircraft in like a real jet that someone's shot a missile at you. Well, you don't want to get hit by it, and going straight at it is probably not a smart idea. So what do? You turn away from it. And the only way to really simulate that is to have that rule where you can just do that. Because if you don't have that, then you're not going to spend your movement that turn to be able to do it. And if you already have, then you're just kind of screwed.
And that's one of the tough things with some of the other systems is that the pre-planned movement, you have to basically, once the other aircraft is shot at you, then you're a defensive maneuver and it's really, in a sense, I'll say, taking game time to do something that should be fairly automatic.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I made it such a trivial action. Like, knowing, you have to know that if you're going to shoot at somebody at long range with a missile and you give them time to turn away, they're going to turn away. So I wanted to make that a quick, simple, easy action that you can just do whenever it happens. Aside from that, there's a lot more play. One of the big advantages that jets have over, prop planes is, of course, speed. They're very fast, especially modern jets. Like, for example, I think the fastest jet in the game is the MiG-31, as it should be. And I would like to note that, again, I had to have the speed values from 1/50 per point of speed to 1/100. And the MiG-31 still has 16 points of raw speed.
Right.
And that is after I take off 25% of their speed value for an afterburner's value. So without that, the MiG-31 is sitting at, what would that be? 22 points of speed if it didn't have the afterburner's value. That's really fast for those that don't know. So then that comes into afterburners. So afterburners, as I've discussed with Mitch in separate conversations, they use a lot of fuel. They're not really something that you can do a whole lot in a fight, but they're a resource that you're there for when you need extra energy. It also, because you're increasing your speed so rapidly, naturally that is going to increase your turn radius. Maybe not your turn rate, but your turn radius. And it's going to make turning in a tight circle a little bit more difficult. It's a very complicated subject. For this game, I have abstracted it so that afterburners, if you do it, you can't make any turns other than your standard 45-degree turn at your end of your movement. And that has been complicated. That's getting changed in 1.31, in case anyone's curious.
Good, because that one just made my head hurt, but that's all right.
It's a clumsy system. I won't lie. I haven't really had a particularly great way to simulate that.
Well, and I think this is, one of the things me stepping from the outside looking in has tried to wrap my brain around, because you've really bit off so much of air combat by doing this, that it's gone from a very simple world of Blood Red Skies where I'm dealing with a fairly small dogfight to now with Jet Age, I'm dealing with the entire intercept. And so in my mind, when I think about a mechanic we're not just talking about it being within visual range. This is a mechanic that has to drive how we're flying the intercept, how we're initiating this whole matchup, but still makes sense when I get into a visual range with somebody else.
Yeah, and having played DSCS World a lot, I can tell you from experience that a bad approach will pretty much lose you a dogfight every single time. If you approach at a lower altitude, if you approach directly at them as opposed to kind of splitting off and circling around. If you don't play defensive, there's so many ways for an approach to go wrong. I don't want a player to have to think about all of these different things. However, I do want to simulate a player having to think, okay, I need to get in somehow, but how do I do that without dying? That's crucial, because that's a lot of what modern jet combat is like. I mean, again, I'm not speaking as an effort, and I can't talk. I'm not speaking as an expert. I'm speaking as someone who has done the studying necessary to figure this all out. The problem is, moving that over to the game part.
Well, and I think that's where I always kind of like, Andy talks about his background in simulator things, and some grognard buddies get up and wave the "I know more about airplanes than you do," which I laugh because I go, we're approximating this, so let's not get bent about what people's experience is, because we're trying to build something that fits the mental picture you have. Because I'll come at it from the other direction and go, none of your games are ever going to perfectly simulate air combat. You just can't. It is such a combination of physical and mental and spatial thinking. For those of us that have done that, we sit there and we laugh and go, I really don't want that anyway, because that's a lot of work. It goes back to flying flight sims back in the days before DCS, when there was Falcon 4.0, Hornet 3.0, and some of these other games. I had Hornet 3.0 while I was a young weapon systems officer training to fly the Hornet, and it was as accurate as our simulator, and it was almost no fun to fly, because it was like going in and flying a full mission in the simulator again. I'm like, gotta do this for work. Why do I don't want to do this when I'm at home. I want something that's fun that I can quickly pick up, shoot down some, and be happy. So there's that point where I always tell people, be careful what you ask for, because sure, we can make the game a lot more simulator-like and put in some of that complexity in those decisions, even if you don't have the physics part, like Air Warhead tracking your energy states, throttle, engine spool, God. All those things. Let's get rid of those. But still, there's so much tactical complexity. I remind guys, hey, you don't want all those decisions to be on there. You don't want to have to think about. You really want to assume your pilot and your crew for that airplane know what they're doing, and you're just trying to pick the least bad way to end this engagement.
Exactly.
Are you saying that you don't just throw on the speed brake and watch them fly right past you?
I'm going to drive to Jacksonville and punch you in the face. So that actually brings up a point I was going to kind of throw in later is if I had to pick one thing as I'm looking at the system that still, I don't say confounds me, because I understand how you did the mechanics. One of the things that I really want to look into playing on the table is how speed interacts on the table. Right. Because it's right now a little bit of a limitation in the propeller version of Blood Red Skies. I think it gets magnified a little bit more now that we have MiG Allen, because suddenly we have some engines that took quite a while to spool up. And if you went from minimum power trying to really throw somebody off to full power, there was some engine spool up time. You didn't immediately move, 600, 700 miles an hour. Right. So I think knowing that's why it's in your mod, because you're not going to go from speed 8 to speed 16, even with the scaling. You're not going to do that rapidly in the real world. But once again, we have the luxury of not having a fixed time scale, a fixed distance scale. We're not trying to make this super hyper accurate. So there's always going to be some compression there, and say, all right, I realize your engine spool up time might be a second and a half, 2 seconds. These turns are simulating what we do over 10 seconds.
Exactly.
There's some leeway there.
Yeah, and I kind of had to rely on that, because if I tried to realistically represent, like we were talking about before, if I tried to realistically represent the range of a Sidewinder versus the range of a Phoenix, we would have to play on the floor.
Right.
That's the kind of ranges that we're talking about. If I assumed that you couldn't just spool up from, your half speed to your full speed in one turn, then we are looking at something like Air War, where I do have to simulate and record every movement of my plane for future reference. And that's the fact that Blood Red Skies doesn't have that is part of what makes it so enjoyable to play.
Sure. And Brett and I sat there talking about it for deflection. Said, maybe we need to track what your speed is, how much you moved each turn, and so is plus that value, not plus your full speed value. And then we realized, we're like, why do we want to do that? It's more record keeping, more bookkeeping, one more chit or die or something you're putting next to that airplane. Like,
I barely remember to use my aircraft trait cards half the time.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I'm not playing this game to have that much tracking. Sure, that would better simulate really how hard that deflection shot should be for that pilot. But we just don't want to go to that level. We know deflection shooting's tough, so we're going to apply the maximum speed value.
Yeah, and that's the exact reason why you are not going to ever find a rule in Jet Age Edition that lists how radar works. I assume that radar works all the time the exact way that it is supposed to. That if there is a plane out there that isn't like a stealth plane, for instance, and that's another discussion to have later, that your radar intercept officer or your pilot is going to be able to find them because they know how to use the radar. I try to make as many concessions and assume that everything is working as it is supposed to. Everything is fine. I compress things a little bit. Like, for instance, shooting attacks in Jet Age Edition for guns are 3 inches now as opposed to 6 inches.
Right.
And that allows me to kind of like, okay, well, now I don't have to have a missile that shoots 36 inches just because my guns shoot at 6 inches.
Right.
Which I have taken advantage of. In essence, and again, as I discussed before, like I said, I have a bias towards granularity, and that's been the hardest thing for developing this game for me, and it's one of the things I'm most grateful for, is teaching me to, put that bias in the closet sometimes and keep it away from the things that don't need it.
Right.
And I think
that's what and I'm sure it's probably tough when you see things that are compressed, like looking at stat line. How am I going to make it distinguish between different aircraft, different models, even of individual aircraft? That's probably got to be pretty frustrating.
Yeah. And there are 2 big examples of that is the agility values that a plane has. Like, how am I supposed to, in terms of a modern dogfight, a 2-degree turn rate difference at a particular airspeed can win a dogfight over another plane. But in terms of the game, how am I supposed to differentiate 2 degrees of turn rate? How am I supposed to do that? I can't. I have to assign it a value of agility of 1, 2, or 3.
Right.
And because some of the speed values of these planes are so high, I can't just let a plane use its speed value for a deflection value anymore. I had to give it its own separate value on a chart. An A10 is down at like the very bottom of the list with a speed of 4 and a deflection of 4, but then you have a MiG-31 that's like 4 times as fast, yet it only has a 9 deflection value, which is just over double. But in reality, it should be a deflection value of 16, but because the game design just rolling 21 dice to dodge a deflection shot and not counting other modifiers, that's a lot. That's a lot. You're never going to hit that, ever. So that is a little frustrating to the realism part of my weird brain. But I realize that it's for the best. I don't think rolling 21 dice to dodge an ace in a MiG-31 is a particularly good idea.
Well, and at some point you come down to the diminishing percentages where it's already percentage anyway. Why are we adding the extra dice to make it an even lower percentage?
Yeah, exactly. So, that's a frustrating thing, but thankfully, the savior that is known as the jet card came along, and this is the part where we talk about that. And I've been waiting all night for this. So the jet card threw a monkey wrench into the way that things play in Jet Age Edition, and I'm so thankful for that, because I say monkey wrench, but in reality, it's probably the best thing that happened to this mod. Because one of the things that I was struggling with is, I wrote a point costing algorithm for these planes. It's not particularly complex. But before, and I had done some limited playtesting within my group, my friend group here. And we kind of found that there's very little difference in the performance of, say, my favorite jet in F5 and say in F14. Yeah, the F5 is costed less because it is inherently less capable. But in terms of the way that the game's played out, the F5 could easily take it.
Right.
It was not that hard. But now that the jet card is around and I can assign generational values to it, an F5 cannot climb unless it is outside of now 6 inches of the F14. It's
Right.
9 inches with the base card. I changed it to 6 inches because I've got to compress the values. But that's a huge disadvantage now, and that's realistic considering that the F5 could never think about outclimbing an F14. It's never going to happen. It doesn't come close. And that's the significant differentiating value that I was looking to have. Because the 4th gen jet should naturally outperform a 3rd gen jet pretty much all the time. And of course, pilots can make up for that. If you put an ace in an F5 and a rookie in an F14, I still think the F5 is going to win.
Yep.
It's just going to be able to hit its shots better, and it's going to move first. It's got all these advantages, and that's the way it should be. But then you step all the way down to, for example, the F-86 Sabre. You put an F-86 Sabre up against an F-14, the F-14 is going to win every time regardless of pilot skill. It's that much better, and it should be. Granted, the Sabre is a lot cheaper, so maybe you could throw 4 Sabres into the mix against one F-14, and that could maybe do something. That's an interesting gameplay development to try out. And I think I have found a comfort zone with tooling around with the plane traits. I've kept a couple of the plane traits because it's hard to really design, like in F-16, for example. It turns really well. And the awesome thing about Blood Red Skies in that case is that it already has the tight turn. But then I introduce the problem of, okay, well, an F-16 turns better than an F-5, which turns better than, say, I don't know. Let me look through my list here for a plane with rapid roll. Maybe it turns better than, I don't know, a MiG-17 or a MiG-21 or something, right? And maybe that turns better than another plane. So I need to expand the range. And then there's a whole lot of other capabilities that a plane might have that isn't represented in Blood Red Skies. What I've taken to doing is just pretty much just designing a whole wide variety of new plane traits that I can tack onto a plane, maybe even planes that have unique traits, either positive or negative, of which I have added a great deal more negative traits to the game. And I think that's probably the best way that I'm going to pad out what made a plane unique or what made a plane vulnerable without, having to tack the literal vulnerable trait to it.
Right.
For example, since I'm talking about the F5 so much, the F5A was notoriously complained about having particularly weak engines. It couldn't climb very well. It was capable. It turned decently well, but it had such weak engines that pretty much anything could outclimb it. So it gets its own, and this is coming in 1.31, by the way, this is not out yet. It's getting its own unique trait called weak thrust. And essentially what that does is when it attempts to climb for advantage, it's got to make a maneuver check. If it doesn't, then it can't. That's pretty much it.
Nice.
And-
Yeah. I think, having set of a slightly more advanced F5, there's a lot of aircraft performance that is tough to understand until you've at least seen, felt, smelled how the plane performs. Because my single F5 ride that I had, I was just surprised that it wasn't a rocket ship. I always assumed it was. I'd fought these guys for years. And seen them, do some amazing things, up at 15, 20,000 feet. But it was really surprising that it had a very gradual takeoff. Kind of had to think about it and go, okay, even though it's got some fairly large engines for the size of the airframe, it really doesn't when you think about it.
Exactly.
It's like aircraft like the L-39 that take off at a 2-degree positive glide slope. It feels like when you're in them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really hard to capture those very subtle details of a plane within a numerical value.
Right.
Like agility or, some such. So yeah, plane traits are the way I try to capture things like that. It's harder the less that I know about a plane or the less information is available for that plane. And there's very little I can do about that. I'm just a civilian. I don't have access to particularly informational documents, especially with regards to Soviet or Chinese planes. But I do what I can. DCS World helps with that. Pretty much any simulator that I can take a look at and compare how planes perform, especially if I have a good understanding of the way an F-18 performs, then I can compare it within that encapsulated instance how another plane might perform.
Right.
I think in terms of the way this game going and the way that I'm developing this mod, I'm probably doing the best that I can. But I'm one of those people where if I always feel like I could do a better job. Whether or not I can or not, I always try, just because, especially with regards to, Jet Age Edition or my other game that I'm working on, if I don't feel like I did the best job I can, how will anybody else feel that way?
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it. Brett, any last minute questions from you?
I was just going to say thanks for being on. It's, really fascinating to hear the things that you have to consider as you're, bringing this idea to life. And I can certainly relate because in our own small way, we've dabbled with, tweaking things and coming up with scenarios. That's been kind of my Doug calls it pet rock, is coming up with interesting narrative scenarios that are a little off the beaten path or whatever. So I can totally relate. I think it's awesome what you're doing, and I really appreciate taking the time to talk with us about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been honestly a really good experience for me in a lot of ways. It influences a lot of the decisions I make in my main game. I have always loved fighter jets. I don't think I have had a conscious moment in my life where at some level I didn't love fighter jets. So this has been important for me to do. I'm so grateful to be able to talk about it in this way. So again, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries. We look forward to talking to you in the future.
Yeah, me too.